different from arranger talk in that today you're going to get the first-person account of a woman who was here just after the fighting at Gettysburg. And I do apologize if you came out expecting to see someone a little bit more traditionally dressed for the time period. I think when we think of the 1800s and we think of women, we conjure up images of those big hoop skirts and the corsets and so forth, which was usually the case, except the woman that I portray actually refused to wear typical middle and upper class women's clothing for her entire life. Her name was Dr. Mary Walker. She was born in 1832 in Oswego Town, New York, and came from a pretty unusual family for the time period. They very firmly believed that they wanted to raise their 5 daughters and 1 son all equally. That meant that they'd all have the same amount of education, they'd all do the same amount of work on their family farm, and for the most part, the children would all be dressed the same. The reason was that at the time, Mary's father was a self-taught doctor, and he very firmly believed that the fashions of the day for women, namely the very tight corsets and the very heavy layers of fabric that they wore, were extremely hazardous to a woman's health, to the point that it threatened a woman's sanity by the time that she died. And he didn't want his daughters growing up that way, and so he allowed them to go about in loose pants and dresses, and eventually Mary developed what she called her reform suit. And what I'm wearing today is a reproduction of that. What I'm wearing is just how it looks. It's a pair of pants and an overdress, and that's all that it is. I do not wear a corset with this, neither would Mary have probably a day in her life. It is navy blue because she worked for the Union Army. Now, Mary was kind of a feisty person, as you'll find out pretty quickly, and she took some liberties with her clothing that she didn't always have the authority to do. She had her clothes tailored, and therefore she designed them herself, and so she put on her pants officer's piping so that everyone would know that she was part of the Army. And she would also wear a surgeon's sash, which I don't wear in this morning's program, but I do in the afternoon. And while she was never commissioned as a surgeon and no one ever gave her the authority to wear that sash, she wore it anyway. So you kind of get a feeling of the type of person that she is. And the hat is a style that was common in about 1865. This costume actually comes from pictures taken of Mary between 1863 and 1865, and is very much as close a reproduction as we could get. Now, when she was 21 years old, Mary decided she wanted to be a doctor, just like her father. So she went to Syracuse Medical College, one of the few schools at the time that would actually accept women, and she was the only female graduate from there in 1855. In that same year, she married and established a private practice in Rome, New York with her husband. But mostly due to the fact that she was female and people did not trust women doctors at the time, her practice was less than spectacularly successful. And Mary ended up going to Washington, D.C. at the outbreak of the war, hoping that her education could be better used by the Union Army. She went to Washington with the intention of being commissioned as a surgeon for the Army now that the Civil War had broken out. And she arrived at Washington somewhat naively, assuming that they would look at her credentials and her education from Syracuse Medical College and immediately make her a doctor based on that alone. Instead, what they did is they looked at her pants, and they looked at her gender, and they looked at her medical education, and said that they had no place in their Army for a woman like her. At the time, as there still remains today, there was a great debate between regular and non-regular medical education. Regular is what we now consider mainstream. Non-regular would be something like what Mary was qualified in, and that was eclecticism. And chances are most of you have never even heard of that, and that's okay. I hadn't heard of it until about 2 months ago. But in the 1800s, it was a very popular cult of medicine based on plant remedies. It was a very holistic, homeopathic, non-invasive approach to taking care of the body. And the American Medical Association particularly said that anybody with a non-regular medical education could not be a surgeon in the Union Army and did not meet their standards. That was for male or female. Unfortunately, the only type of medical education a woman could receive at the time was non-regular. So Mary had a couple of things going against her. But she refused to take no as an answer, and she stayed in Washington, D.C., working from there for the rest of the war in a variety of capacities. Now, you're going to meet here in the year 1865. It is July, and the war is finally over with. Now, Mary has returned here for a variety of reasons. One of them is to just see this field in peacetime, as many of the veterans often would do, just to get a better perspective on all of this. But her other reason for being here, and actually, ma'am, if you would be so kind as to play this role for me, it requires as much or as little participation as you feel you want to. But if you could be my Miss Lydia Housebrook. You are very much a real person at the time. You used to be a doctor in Washington, D.C., but then you became the founder and editor of The Sybil, which was a woman's reform magazine that focused mostly on suffrage and dress reform for the time period. Lydia and Mary were friends, and today you are doing an article about Mary's adventures and escapades during the War of the Rebellion. Now that gives me a vehicle through which I can tell her story. Now the rest of you all have a role. You all thought you just had to stand there and not do anything, but you do represent something, and you are very much here in 1865. You're going to be, for me, a rather common problem in Mary's life. and that would be a rather rowdy crowd she had a tendency of drawing. And believe it or not, it was because of her pants. At the time, pants were considered the ultimate sign of male power, and for a woman to have the gall to wear them in public was seen as a complete slap in the face of all male authority. Men and women alike despised the fact that Mary wore pants. And she was, in fact, arrested on a couple of occasions for the pants that she wore and for the rather raucous and rude crowd she had a tendency of drawing. And now, typically, the crowds would make fun of her and throw things at her, and as much as I welcome any type of group participation you're willing to lend, I just ask that you not throw things at me. But beyond that, do whatever you want, say whatever you want, I don't really mind. Now, in order to go back to that year, we do all need to be properly attired. So ladies, I'm going to assume that you will all be middle and upper class women in 1865, and therefore this means that you will all be wearing what is about a sum total of 18 different pieces of clothing on any given day. Now Lydia, you don't have to worry about this, you and I are both in pants, so you can go about nice and full. But for the rest of you, your ensemble would look somewhat like this. On the top you will have on your chemise, and then you'll have your corset, and then you'll have your corset cover, and then a couple more layers on top of that. And on the bottom you'll have your hoop skirt, and your layer of crinoline, and a couple layers of petticoats, and another layer on top of that. And then you'll have your pantaloons and stockings and garters and boots and hat and parasol and handkerchief and fan. And this is what you wear on any given day. If you're here for any other purpose other than just walking around town, you'll have another layer of clothing on indicating that. It's very tight, it's very heavy, it's all that you've known since you were about 5 years old. And as a result, when you take off your corset, you really have no stomach muscles left whatsoever, so you have a tendency of flopping over. But that's just how you are. And now, any of the younger girls in the crowd, actually, you will have on what are called stays. Those are like practice corsets for the time. Now, gentlemen, you will be dressed in probably 2 or 3 piece suits made out of wool, which is what I'm wearing. And you'll have a little silk tie and a hat of some sort or another. And if anybody here doesn't look as though, well, maybe you're under 5, but if you're under 5 at the time period, it didn't matter if you were a boy or a girl, you would wear a skirt, so we were all equal at one point. In order to go back to that year, we do also need to change the ground that we're standing on. This pavement would not have been here. These trees would have been recently planted, if at all, in 1865. This was someone's private property before this battle ever happened. All the monuments that you see around the periphery of the cemetery, the Soldiers' National Monument that stands in the very center of it, and the speaker's rostrum you see behind us here, all were not here in 1865. The headstones that we will come across in the very center of the cemetery were here in that year. And as we go back in time, please try to remove from your mind as much as possible the sounds of the modern day distractions. The year 1865 will begin when we pass not this large tree on the right over here, but as we walk along the path here, you'll find another one right on your right. It has a little crack in the pavement. After that point, when we pass that crack, is when the year 1865 will begin. And after that, if you have anything you want to say or any questions you want to ask, which I welcome, just keep in mind you'll be asking Dr. Mary Walker in 1865 and not Jan anymore in 1997. Just a little disclaimer before I begin my program. If anyone feels compelled to research Mary when this is all over with, you'll find almost nothing about what she did here at the Battle of Gettysburg. She was here. But what she did exactly, she never wrote about, but she wrote about everything else that she did. So the story that I'll relate to you as to why she was here and what exactly she did, unfortunately, is only speculation. But it's the best scenario that I can come up with based on what Mary did prior to this battle. But everything else that I will talk about, all of her opinions about certain people, all the things that happened to her, are taken almost verbatim from the memoirs that she did write. So I just don't want you all to think that I'm lying to you. I'm just doing the best with the information that I have. So, having that been said, the program will run about 40 minutes. You may sit down in the program, that is fine, I don't mind. If you don't feel very comfortable, if you want to go in and get a drink of water, please, it's a hot day, go ahead. I won't be offended if you have to leave. And guys, I'm just warning you ahead of time, I'm just not very kind to you in the program, so please don't take offense. She didn't like you very much.
We'll not be kind back.
I'm sorry?
We won't be kind back.
Well, good, that'll be fun, all right. And Lydia, you do not have your male escort with you here today, you are alone. If we could go back to the year 1865 and we'll meet Dr. Mary Walker.
The kitchen, why aren't you in the kitchen still?
Why aren't you in the kitchen, sir? I haven't perhaps left you. Sir, I think that perhaps there are far better things that ladies can do with their minds other than stand in front of a hot stove all day long.
But who will take care of the kids?
Well, sir, perhaps there's a chance for you to take that opportunity and learn how to do that. I know it would be quite a stretch for you, but perhaps you would be rather good at it after a little while. I think maybe perhaps if you dressed you in a corset and a dress all day long, that would be most appropriate for you. And I think perhaps you better appreciate exactly what we do in the kitchen.
Well, I appreciate it. I eat well.
Yes, I can tell, sir, yes. People are coming to see us. Absolutely fascinating. Well, Lydia, do you think it's because of our pants or because we do not have a man at our side to escort us here that all these people insist on following us everywhere that we go? And do you think perhaps a little bit of both?
Maybe both.
Probably. Do you mind if I go ahead and just for those of you who do not know me, I am in fact Dr. Mary Walker. If you are not from Washington, well, I will excuse that for just a moment. And allow me to clarify. I do not wear men's clothing. I wear my own clothing. This is what I've worn my entire life. Yes, sir, I saw that rather confused look in your eye. Does it bother you somewhat that I'm standing here as a lady in pants in front of you? Does that make you a little bit uncomfortable?
Maybe a little bit uncomfortable,
A little bit,
yes.
yes, sir. Well, do you have a wife, sir? Or do you have a sister or perhaps a daughter or anything like that? Well, have you ever in your life asked them exactly what it is like to walk around all day long with a corset, binding and gagging them, and with many layers of fabric all day long? Have you ever asked them that?
No, I grew up with that. I was a custom of the times.
Well, of course, sir. Well, perhaps maybe someday you should take the time to ask them that, and that, my sir, will be a very uncomfortable experience. You see, ma'am, have you ever in your life, and I will completely understand if you do not want to be honest, given our company here, but do you ever have those moments in your life when you just, you feel just so tight and so constricted, and you feel as though you just can't think and you just can't breathe, and all you really want to do is just lie down. You feel as though your sanity is so close to the edge. You have those moments.
Spell coming on.
Yes, exactly, ma'am. Well, despite what your husband or any other male members of your household may tell you, it has nothing to do with your mind. It's entirely to do with that coffin of death you insist on putting on yourself. And ladies, you all look at me very smugly, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. Those things we put ourselves in, it's killing us slowly, you see. I do not understand why you insist on wearing them. There's this great debate about what we should do now. I was thinking this the other day, Lydia, what we should do with Jeff Davis now that this war is finally over with, and, well, we need to punish the man. I was thinking the most appropriate punishment would be to dress that man up in a corset and perhaps 4 or 5 layers of fabric and force him to run up and down the stairs of a 4-story house all day long. I do think he'll be weeping by the day's end, don't you think, ladies? But, well, at any rate, you did not come out here to hear my lecture. Typically it works to make them go away, but they seem to insist on standing here, so we might as well include them. For those of you who do not know her, this is Miss Lydia Hausberg. She's a fascinating woman. She's started this wonderful magazine about suffrage and dress reform. Now, ladies, I understand probably a woman like yourself, you do not feel as though you have the need to have the right to vote. I get that impression from many women. They feel as though their husbands can express all the political opinions that they have. Am I correct, ma'am? Well, ma'am, you see, in order for us to be freed from those torture chambers, and that's all that they are, we must have the right to vote, you see. This was not supposed to be a lecture about suffrage either, so I'll try to stay on.
I'll just put it in the magazine.
All right, thank you. Well, would it be best for me then to start with my time here? Would that be best?
Yes.
All right. You see, Lydia is doing an article about my adventures and escapades during this War of the Rebellion. Now, I was thinking on the way here that perhaps, we could change the title of that article. I think heroics would be slightly more appropriate, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, let me begin then. Now, let's see, I had arrived in town early evening on the 3rd after the fighting had come to an end here in Gettysburg in '63, of course. Now, I had come as far as Westminster from Washington, and I'd come by train, of course, there. And I come all the way there to Westminster, and I stopped there. Oh, yes, because the enemy had completely destroyed the line from there all the way into the center of town, and so I had to go buy a horse. Ma'am, do you have a horse? Well, of course, do you have a horse of your own?
I don't know, my husband has one.
Oh, well, perhaps you should try to acquire one. If not, perhaps take his, and the next time, don't listen then, sir. You don't have to listen to this. It'd be absolutely vulgar. Oh, well, sir, next time you ride the horse, take off your skirt. Ride that thing as a man would. Don't bother with the side saddle method. That's the stupidest invention a man ever had. Ride it as a man would, and do you have pistols at home? Oh, ma'am. Well, get yourself some pistols and put them at your side and ride about. It'll be the most exhilarating experience you'll ever have in your life, I guarantee it. But, well, at any rate, that's my normal form of transportation. That is how I came into the center of town, you see. And my intention, I was looking for my Indiana boys, you see. And they were some of my dearest friends, and I remember them so, but I'm not from Indiana, I'm actually from New York, but some of the boys that I had met at the beginning of the war at the Patent Office Hospital, I'd grown to be so close to them, and, well, I'd missed them in the year and a half that I had not seen them, and so I decided to look for them here. Which actually reminds me, Lydia, do you mind if we just break for just a moment, and could I visit some of my friends? Would that be all right? Well, if you'd like to all come with me, please. Very enough. was November, I suppose it was, of '63. And then it looked very, very different than it does now. It was completely covered in dirt in that year. Well, now let me see. Oh, yes. Well, I came into the center of town, as I said, looking for my Indiana boys. And they had sent me, actually, I remember now, I come across some fellows who said that perhaps I would find my Indiana boys at the White Church, which, if you follow the road along the other side of that cemetery there, follow it for about 2 miles or so, and you will come across the White Church. It was a First Corps hospital, and many of the Indiana boys are from there. My heavens, I have not thought of this in so long. I think perhaps we remember the good things and not the bad things more often than anything. You see, I had passed by these fields on my journey there. Yes, I remember now. I remember thinking I had every intention of hastening to the White Church as soon as I possibly could to get to those boys, but when I passed by these fields, I found myself staying here for most of the day. You see, this entire area was completely covered in bodies in July, just after the fighting had come to end. You see, this ground is the site of very heavy fighting on that first and second day, I think it was. And, you would not believe what I saw. I remember, as I went around, I tried to close my eyes so I didn't have to look at those boys, but if you did, it just intensified the sound of them screaming, you see. Everywhere that you went in this town, far into the night, the boys would moan and cry, and all they wanted was just anything that we could give them. And you see, every building in town was completely full of wounded men, and we had no place else to put them, and so men stayed in these fields for almost 5 days, some of them. There they stayed, and I remember thinking, at the time, it's so remarkable how adept our government is at supplying our boys, giving them everything they could possibly want to kill themselves with, and gave them nothing to take care of themselves with when it was all over. You see, because the railroad line had been cut in Westminster, the Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission could not arrive, and they had everything that we needed. And then men like General Meade were put in charge of these armies. Now, I understand that the man only took charge of it a few days before, and perhaps he was a little bit confused. But for any one of us, it does not take much more than an ounce of common sense to figure this out. You see, the man, he had everything that we needed. He had all the supplies, all the bandages, all the clean water, all the medicines. And he deemed them unnecessary when the fighting was all over with and moved them 30 miles away from the front. So everything that we could have used was gone. Of course, it was unnecessary to him because he picked up his army and moved the day or two after the fighting was all over with. And we were left with nothing, you see. And I was using my nightgowns. I remember women in town were using their curtains and their bed sheets, just tearing them up and using them as bandages as much as they could. And everything in my medical case was gone. And it just seemed as though we would solve one problem and another one would come barreling towards us. Well, persistent problems like the smell in this town. For the week afterwards, everywhere that you went, it just smelled so horribly, and there's so many men on the fields. I think they said we had about 50,000 boys who needed some kind of care when this was all over with. And the smell from all of those men, dead and alive, and then they started to burn the horses. You were a fool to not walk out of your house without a handkerchief over your nose, and the flies were so horrible. There are accounts written of the fighting here that the birds, they came and pecked away at the boys. Well, trust me, the birds were not doing that. The hogs took care of that. The birds had been scared away from all the fighting, and all we had left were more flies than I've ever seen in my life. And it would not matter if a man was alive or dead. They would eat away at them, and then the maggots would form, and you never knew to listen to a man if he was screaming from his wounds or from the itching from those flies. And there was nothing that we could do. And to look at the men who had already passed on, I think perhaps they were more fortunate in many ways. To look at them, it would not seem that way. But, sir, have you ever in your life seen what happens to a body when it stays out in fields like this for 3 or 5 days? Have you ever seen that? You'll never forget it on all of your life. For those of you who have not seen it, you see, when a man dies, and there are not enough people to properly take care of him on fields like this, you see, the gases inside of the body, they start to build up. And from the pressure of that and from the heat of the sun, you see, the men, they will burst, particularly their abdomen area. And to see these boys who had fought so bravely for whatever it was that they believed in, and then see the faces on those mothers when they had traveled so far to find their loved ones. And there he was, with his insides out and his face is so blackened that you could not even identify him. There was nothing glorious about what happened here. It was just the most pitiful state of human condition I've ever seen in my life. And outside of every door and every window in town, there were piles and piles of limbs. And I'm not exaggerating, you see. We have all seen the men who have returned from the front who are perhaps missing an arm, or missing a leg, or perhaps part of their face. And we all like to think that the doctors and the surgeons, they are doing all that they can to help these boys, and that was necessary. Trust me, I've seen it, and it is everything but necessary. You see, in the chaos of the fighting that happened here, the doctors, the surgeons, felt as though they could do nothing else but cut off limbs. And that's all that they did for days and days. It did not matter if it was a mere flesh wound or if the entire part of a leg had been torn away. They would amputate. And you see, it is the most grisly practice I've ever seen in my life. And I thought, what a waste of human life and of that man's livelihood. And I relied upon a tactic which I found to be rather successful. Well, you see, they do not allow me to do any type of surgery. They assume because I'm a woman I will faint. And so instead what I do is, whenever I find a man who is in a hospital, who is protesting his amputation, I will casually ask to see the wound, and I will go to that man and tell him very plainly that he has every right to say what happens to his body, and no one has the right to take away his limbs without his permission. It's all very simple. I don't think any one of us would want that to happen. So I tell him that when the doctors come, the surgeons come to take off his limb, I tell him to protest as loudly as he possibly can. And if that doesn't work, then if the man has never used swearing words in all of his life, I tell him to swear to high heaven, think of as many words as he possibly can, swear as loudly as he possibly can, and claim that he will never rest until he has shot every surgeon dead who has performed that operation when it is all over with. And usually these places, they are foul with language I've never heard before, but it works beautifully. You should see that. The men, they feel as though they have control over what is happening to them, and that is a wonderful form of medicine, you see. No, I think I've saved many lives just by doing that. And yet, it's so ironic that the government, you see, still refuses to acknowledge that I'm a qualified doctor. It considers me to be nothing but a nuisance to their army. Lydia, I never told you this story before, and well, perhaps if I share it, you'll better understand me. You see, there are great rumors going about that what I do merely for attention, and that I just want to be in the limelight. Perhaps if I share this rather embarrassing situation with you, you'll better understand exactly what I'm up against. You see, all I've ever wanted to do my whole life is just live by my principles, and I'm finding that to be rather difficult. You see, they finally offered me a position as a contract surgeon for the 52nd Ohio in the beginning of '64. And they told me that I had to appear before the medical board in order to prove my credentials and my education, which I did not see as an obstacle. And so I appeared before them, and they wasted my time asking me questions, female questions. Things like, was I married? What type of home did I keep? How many children did I have? Questions that had nothing to do with whether or not I was qualified to be a doctor, and questions they never would have asked a man. And so on they went, and finally they wrote in their report that as far as they could tell, Mary Walker had never seen the insides of a medical institution, nor by their standards did she have any more medical knowledge than that of an ordinary housewife. But you know what they also wrote in their report? Yeah. They wrote that I had pants on, and that I was a woman, and that my education was non-regular. You see, they had no intention of ever deeming me qualified. All they cared about was how I looked, and that did not meet their standards. You see, so I wouldn't be doing this for my own amusement if that is what I had to face every day of my life. But it is rather humorous to me how everywhere that I go I am faced with the same opinions. You see, I was in the South during this war, at some point in the '64, you see, and I was taking care of families in Georgia. And at one point, I was taking care of them, and on one of my journeys, unfortunately, I lost my way, and I was taken prisoner by Confederate officers. They accused me of being a spy. The whole incarceration, I care not to repeat. You've all heard the story anyway, but you see, what was most amusing was the interrogation that they did of me before they sent me to my cell. You see, they sat me down, and this very tall Confederate man gave me a very fatherly lecture that went on for about an hour, rambling on and on. telling me that if I was trying to be a spy, perhaps I should put on a nice dress and make myself a little less conspicuous, and on he went. And finally he said, "Ma'am, you seem to be only something the depraved Union Army could have produced." Finally, I grew so tired of his tirade, I used a tactic I'm finding to be rather beneficial of being of our gender, ladies. I broke down and cried just to shut the man up, and it worked beautifully. This broad grin spread across his face, and he looked at me very smugly as if he had finally won me over, and I had seen the errors of my thinking. Trust me, it'll take much more than a very tall Confederate man to convince me that my principles are incorrect. Lydia, we seem to have strayed entirely from whatever it was we were talking about. My time here. Actually, I think I've talked enough about myself. There's actually someone I wanted to tell you about, and since you're all here, well, please, if you'll indulge me. You see, it seems so often to be the case that the armies would come rampaging through everyone's lives and land and wreak havoc and cause chaos and leave their messes behind them. And then they would charge off and fight other battles. And then the women were left to pick up when it was all over with. Does this sound familiar to your home lives, women? I'm not quite sure. At any rate, you will appreciate this story then, ma'am. You see, this woman seemed to epitomize that idea entirely. She lived in the house that you see through the trees over there, that brick one. Her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth Thorne was her name. And her husband had been the caretaker of the cemetery that you see over here, this private one. Now, he had gone off to fight for the Union long before this battle ever happened, and he had left her to take care of his cemetery in his absence. Well, she agreed. But when the fighting was all over with, the owner of the cemetery came to her and told her that she was responsible for picking up her backyard, which I think I mentioned earlier. This entire ground was entirely covered in bodies, and her cemetery was of no exception. You know, she did it. It was so incredibly hot, like it is today, and she said every time she leaned over a body, she nearly fainted from the sight and the smell of it rotting in front of her. And she only had the help of her father. He was a very small, fragile man. She had 3 children to take care of, and, well, generals had used her home and left nothing but bloody mattresses in her cellar. And how remarkable on top of all that woman. You see, she was 6 months pregnant at the time when they asked her to do that. And I thought, my heavens, 50 or 60 bodies she put in the ground. It took her days, but she did it. And I thought, how remarkable as well, that no one would ever remember her story. That no one would ever think that a woman could do that type of work. But she did it, without complaint. Perhaps we can write a whole nother article just about her someday. That would be useful. At any rate, to finish with my time here, I came back for the dedication of the cemetery, which... that was in November, you see. And it was over there in that cemetery that you see now. This whole area was covered with dirt at the time. They were still burying the bodies in November, and so we had to have it over there. And that was the first time I'd ever heard Lincoln speak before. He was a very kind man. He looked very tired, though, I thought. I had a lot of respect for the man. I hope his soul rests easy now. I think we both tried to live by our principles, and we were both leaders of unpopular causes, I guess. But to be perfectly honest with all of you, I do think the man was a bit of a coward. And I don't mean in the normal ways that the newspapers have criticized him for. I mean, I think towards the women he was a coward. You see, I wrote him a letter in January of '64. I told him everything that I had done for his army. This was before I was commissioned as anything. And I told him about all of my time at Fredericksburg and with General Burnside and his typhoid breakout in '62 and all of my time here and at the Battle of Chickamauga and all the things I had done for the women and children in Washington. And all I asked him to do was to just put in a good word for me to perhaps help me to get a position, perhaps as a doctor in a female hospital. That would be more appropriate. At least I could use my skills. And I added that if any man had rendered the services that I had rendered, that they would have removed a star from the national heavens and placed it on my shoulder, but because I was a woman, they would never do that. He wrote me back, though. Would you believe it? You know what he said? He said that he did not have the authority to disrupt the hierarchy of the American Medical Association, nor did he want to be the strong hand that influenced them into deciding who could be a doctor for the Army and who could not. And I thought, who then? Perhaps all of you can enlighten me. had that authority. If the leader of our nation did not have the power to put in one good word for one woman, who did? If he did not care, who was going to do anything? Perhaps it is not proper to reprimand a man who's already died. I try not to pay attention too much to those things, but at any rate, I do remember what he said in that speech over there. He said that the world will no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And he was right, I think. I think that they will always remember the generals and the tactics and all the soldiers and all of the bravery and all of the gallantry, nor should that ever be forgotten. But ladies, to be honest with all of you, I am afraid that as long as the men write the history books, that is about all that they will remember. They won't remember Mrs. Thorne, or the young girls like yourself, who every day went into the hospitals. No one asked them to, no one paid them anything. And they went to the hospitals and they would take care of those boys when they could not have their mothers there. And they would help them write letters home, and they would read them passages from the Bible, or they would sing to them, just to keep their spirits up. And when the men were told that they were to have their legs cut off, both of them, they would hold their hands because they were so scared. And when they died, after the gangrene would set in, they would bury them. And when the mothers would arrive, finally, it always seemed to be 2 hours too late or something like that, they would show them where they were buried, and they would hold those women when they cried. It was nothing glorious. They don't reserve any awards for them, but it helped to heal those women, you see. And it gave those boys something before they died. And they will never remember them. They won't remember me, Lydia. Perhaps they'll remember me for what I didn't do, that I didn't wear a dress, or I didn't have the right education for their standards. Well, I just didn't stand on the periphery like every other woman, not wanting any compensation or attention for what I do. Ladies, you may not agree with my tactics, and that is just fine. I really don't care. But you see, you know what you do every day of your lives, and you know that they do not applaud you for that, and they don't give you any awards, and they don't write great stories about it. But we do what needs to be done, and it keeps us alive, you see. See, someone has to start it, and perhaps that's how I see myself. But maybe I suppose I've rambled on enough for one day. I do need to get back to Washington now, but I hope I've given you enough information for the article. Perhaps next time we can write about Elizabeth or the girls or something. But for those of you, I hope I have not offended you. That was never my intention. I'm finding that tends to be the nature of the truth on most occasions. But, well, if you all hate me so much, well, so be it. But, ladies, if you never think of me ever again in all of your lives, please just do one thing for me when you go home. Take off your corsets. Perhaps slip on your husband's pants when he's not looking, and sit in his chair, or at least take a book off the shelf you never thought you could read, and I guarantee you'll be thinking amazing things by the day's end. I promise. I wish you all Godspeed, whatever it is that you are going. Good day to you all. Just reform parts of it during the talks. She was even for a while associated with and worked intensely with the suffragettes that we are more familiar with. However, even they grew to dislike her tactics. They didn't like the fact that she refused to give up wearing pants, which gives you a better idea of the type of ridicule a woman would receive at the time for wearing pants. Even the suffragettes would not wear them. And they thought her to be too egotistical, and that her personality was lending a very negative air to their causes. And so they separated from one another, and Mary struck out on her own. But by 1887, she had alienated and really angered so many people, including all of her friends and family, with her personality and her just adamant desire to live by her principles. That she couldn't get any work as anything else, and so Mary became a sideshow attraction at a circus. And there, for $150 a week, she would be paid to talk about her experiences during the war, and about the Medal of Honor, and about women's rights. I personally find it interesting to note that that was an acceptable platform for talking about women's rights at the time, was at a circus. Fortunately, but by 1917, really, that year was probably when she received her worst blow in all of her life. She was 84 years old, and a commission was established to review all the medals of honor given out during the Civil War. They changed the standards, and by doing so, they took back 900 of them, and one of them included Mary Walker's, saying that it was unclear what she had done during the war. Since so few people would accept her as a doctor, they didn't know if she had been a nurse or if she had been a spy, saying essentially she had done nothing more than what an ordinary citizen would have done under the same circumstances. So they took it back. In reality, Mary refused to give it up and wore it every day after that until she died 2 years later at the age of 86. So feisty till the end. But unfortunately, she did die pretty lonely and poor woman in that year. She married once in 1855, as I mentioned in the beginning, to Albert Miller. She did wear a tuxedo to her own wedding. She refused to take her husband's last name and omitted the honor and obey part of the ceremony. And then she divorced him 14 years later. She accused him of committing adultery. But at the time, for a wife to accuse a husband of that was not seen as grounds for divorce, and therefore it took her 7 years to be officially divorced from her husband. After that point, she was a little bitter towards men, if you couldn't pick that up in the program, and she never married again and never had any children. And unfortunately, she did grow to be pretty eccentric, and I do question her sanity as she got to be older. I don't want to make a hero out of her, mostly because she did plenty to bring on her own grief. She was not the most pleasant person to be around. She was adamant about what she wanted to do with her life, and at times that made her, by some people's accounts, very violent and vindictive and very cruel. And so there's a lot of very conflicting stories about her. But at least enough family members were enlightened by what she had done just during the war that in 1977 they reinstated her Medal of Honor, and she's the only female recipient of it. And I think the major reason why we don't really know much about her or don't read much about her is that she didn't fit the mold. She didn't fulfill the traditional women's role at the time period. She wanted attention, she wanted money, she wanted accolades for all the things that she had done all of her life, and that was not how a woman was to act at the time. She was very much ahead of her time, and it made people kind of uncomfortable. Thanks so much for coming out here today. I really appreciate your attention and everything. As I mentioned earlier, we have lots of other programs going on here today. Please take advantage of them. They are all free. If anybody has any questions about Mary or medicine or anything else that was brought up in the program that you're curious about, please stick around. I'd love to answer them. Thanks so much. And thank you for being my Lydia. I appreciate it.